Okay, we are finally in Act 2 of Epic. This is the Thunder Saga, and I would bet we are going to be going through the Sirens and at least the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis. Maybe we'll even hit Helios's cattle here. I'm not entirely sure. I took a quick glimpse at the track, so I do know at least we're hitting the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis, which means you have to hit the Sirens. And the final song makes me think maybe we're hitting Helios's cattle. Just a thought there. But at the end of Act 1, we had gone through the underworld, and I had said it's very likely we're not going back to Circe's island, as technically that is an encounter in the Odyssey which takes place in 2 parts. We're there, we go to the underworld, we come back. Now, mostly we go back in order to deal with the death of Elpenor and give him proper burial rites and funerary rites and go through that. But the other important part of going back to Circe's island is the fact that she gives Odysseus some very helpful advice about areas on the sea he's going to have to pass through and how he should pass through them in order to survive. Very specifically, she talks about the Sirens, she talks about these crashing rocks, and then she talks about the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis. And she notes when you get to the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis that, frankly, it is an extremely narrow strait with very high cliff sides on either way. And on one side you have Scylla, who is a many-headed monster, specifically 6. And then on the other side you have Charybdis, which is sort of believed to be some kind of massive whirlpool-like being, and essentially that's a death sentence for you and everybody in your crew. But if you hug Scylla's side, you won't have to deal with Charybdis because you'll be on the other side of the strait, which again is so narrow it is described as being as narrow as able to shoot an arrow from one side to another. So very, very narrow. But if you hug the side of Scylla, you are guaranteed to lose 6 men. And while Odysseus does say, is there a way to kind of avoid dying either way, Circe's like, yeah, no. So, just accept the fact you are likely to lose 6 men and therefore save everybody else on the ship, then go towards Charybdis, which is just a bad idea. In the case of the Sirens, Circe very specifically tells Odysseus, look, the thing with the Sirens, who were known to the Greek heroes at this point, Jason and the Argonauts had gone through them. The main thing is that their song is said to be so beautiful, it causes sailors to die. Now, that happens in a couple ways. One, sailors try to steer their ship towards these rocks where the Sirens hang out, and their ship smashes on the rocks and everybody goes down with the ship. They steer their ship towards the rocks, and hey, if you survive, you then try to swim for the island. And this is even if you don't steer your ship, you try to swim for the island. Well, if you swim for the island, you likely get smashed against the rocks and you die. But if by some miracle you make it to the rocks where the Sirens hang out, you basically waste away at their feet listening to their song. That is how incredible their song is. Now, in the case of Jason and the Argonauts, the way that they got through it was 1, rowing for all their might, while 2, Orpheus sang even louder than the Sirens. So they kind of had a cheat code in the form of Orpheus. Odysseus and his men do not. So Circe says, look, you have your men plug up their ears with beeswax, and you do the same. But because you are a curious motherfucker, if you are that curious and want to hear the Song of the Sirens and say that you lived through it, she goes, have your men essentially lash you to your mast so that you cannot escape. And listen, and make sure they know that no matter how much you cry out for them to untie you and let you go, they cannot listen. In fact, they should even tie you tighter when you do that until you are through and you're approaching the area of the crashing rocks, because that way you know you're through the Sirens. And so that is how they get through these Sirens, who are these beautiful part bird, part woman creature, often depicted as having the head of a woman and the body of a bird.
2,000 years later.
So this first song is called Suffering. I did see that a lot of people said the first and the second song go together. So Suffering and Different Beast go together, similarly to how Done For and There Are Other Ways go together. So long as my time allows, I'm going to be listening to those back to back. Let's go into what I assume will be Odysseus and his encounter with the Sirens, which, in the case of Epic the Musical, we are working under the assumption that Odysseus and his men have not been given any hints and frankly don't know what they're in for right now. Which, oh boy, they're in for a ride. Oh, Penelope's theme, very airy. In fact, the dee dee da 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 dee da 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 da, that rhythm that's being done in voices in the back, that's clearly like a sound, a MIDI file of voices, or at least it's been electronically manipulated. I think that's a hint that these are meant to be the Sirens. Even though we're singing about Penelope, I could be wrong, but let's keep going and see. All these, this has got to be the Sirens.
Don't you miss me more than you know? Then jump in the water and kiss me. Penelope, I've told you this before.
So fun fact, because I do think this is the Sirens, and if this is the Sirens, this is a clever way to do it, and it's actually not the first time I've seen something like this. Now again, we talked about the Sirens and that they have this beautiful song that lures sailors ultimately to their doom. Fun fact, when I was very little, I mean elementary school, not even in the double digits, my grandfather showed me a film adaptation of the Odyssey that I think must have been like an Italian production or a co-Italian production. One, they used all the Romanized versions of the characters, so the film was actually, I believe, called Ulysses and not Odysseus. I think it was from, I want to say, like the 60s. And what they did with the Sirens was, one, they never showed them on screen, which I'm like, yo, when you have like no real computer technology, hey, that's smart to not have anybody see them and you just want to hear them because their song is the important bit. But what they did was that with Odysseus lashed to the mast and all of that, it was actually the actress who was playing Penelope, the voices of Penelope, and even like a made-up voice for Telemachus, I believe, and like his mom and all these other characters calling out to Odysseus. And so what he's trying to do is get back to them, because obviously Odysseus' driving force is get back home to Ithaca, get back home to Penelope and Telemachus and his father Laertes, who's still there, and all of that. But that was how they did it, as opposed to it being some sort of unearthly song. So the fact that Jorge is, yes, giving you a song, as is the Sirens are known for, but doing it in the guise of Penelope's voice, is one, really smart in that you give Penelope's singer more to do, but also very clever, because that is a trick that has been used at least by Hollywood, or Italian Hollywood? I swear I think this was an Italian co-production. I don't know why that sticks in my head. I've literally never watched this film since, so I only remember bits and pieces of it. But this is something I have seen done before, and I think it's a pretty clever thing to do. Because if the audience doesn't know about the Sirens, it might not immediately tip them off, especially if you're not staging it where you're revealing the Sirens or making it seem like a dream sequence or something. Like, there's ways to do this. Anywho, had to stop and just say, I'm pretty sure this is the Sirens, and that's extremely clever.
You know I'm afraid of the water.
Oh, come on, no, he's not. He lives on an island.
That you are safe and sound.
Scared of the ocean, yes.
Come play with me and our daughter.
Definitely the Sirens.
Love,
Definitely the Sirens. We know they have a son, Telemachus, and not a daughter, but a Siren's not going to know that. I love these little clues. Very nice, very nice.
Oh, I would, but I'd be suffering trying to float the whole time.
He would, though. In that current, he'd never make it.
Right here, I'm just fine. I can take the suffering from you. You know that I prefer my feet on the ground. I will take the
as much as I'm laughing, like, he's not scared of the water. What I mean is that, like, he wouldn't be afraid of the idea of swimming. After all, Ithaca is an island. In order to get anywhere, really, that's not Ithaca, they have to be on the water. They are sea people. Now, to be fair, the ocean, the sea, is terrifying to them. So I think maybe that's more what Jorge's going for, but they're playing it like he's afraid of swimming, which is admittedly kind of funny. Which, like, am I supposed to be laughing at this? I don't know, but I am, because it is just kind of funny. And the idea that Odysseus is playing along, which is sort of interesting, again, contrasted with how it is in the Odyssey. The Odyssey, this is not in a, like, fun and funny atmosphere. This is a very dramatic, intense, and ultimately slightly more scary atmosphere. But you don't want to present something like a Siren as ultimately scary at first glance, because, like, who's gonna want to follow that, especially if you're not doing it in the whole idea of a, like, unearthly song. So Jorge is very much similarly to how he buried the lead, if you will, that Polyphemus is Poseidon's son, and anything else. He's burying the lead again here. This is a good place to do that. Especially, again, if people are not familiar with the idea of the Sirens, here's a good spot to bury the lead. And I think it's going to be tougher when you get to the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis, because you're going to have to do some explaining, but, like, we're not there yet.
Fine, but only if you answer a question or two.
Of course.
Okay, So let's say I was on the run, or hiding, from, I don't know, Poseidon. And let's say he blocked the way home with giant waves and giant storms.
So we're taking, again, I noted this is a conversation he has with Circe, and this is information she offers up to him willingly, just sort of as a fair warning, like, you're leaving, let me give you some tips, 'cause, you're in for a journey, even though obviously she's not a prophet, she doesn't know everything he's going to face, but she gives him fair warning on this, like, 3-part encounter, Sirens, crashing rocks, Scylla and Charybdis. So we've transposed this to him talking to the Sirens, which would explain, in this case, if again we're burying the lead about the Sirens, why I'm assuming he's the one who doesn't have his ears filled with wax. The one important thing, though, is that he's showing remarkable self-control. I mean, part of, again, the whole thing with the encounter is that if you're not going to stuff your ears with beeswax, which means you can't hear a damn thing, and since he's responding and having conversation with her, we're assuming he can hear, especially because, you know, there are birds that are flying around and all that, he would be lashed to his mast, which would kind of be a giveaway and look weird on the stage. So I have a couple of questions as to how we're doing this, because obviously that's part of the fundamental aspects of the encounters, that their voice and their song is so unearthly, literally no one can overcome it. And the only reason Jason and the Argonauts got through was because they had the cheat code in the form of Orpheus, who is the son of the muse Calliope, or Calliope, who is the muse of epic poetry, and they had him singing so goddamn loud he drowned out the Sirens. And then even the Sirens kind of wanted to stop and listen to him because his voice was that unique. So Odysseus didn't have that. I have questions, Jorge, about the logistics of this, because the idea that Odysseus would have the self-control to not, like, fling himself overboard and try to swim for the Sirens, especially if they're using Penelope's voice, at least as the Sirens are in the Odyssey, absolutely not. They are in that way. That is how dangerous they are, is that there's no way. He would still have to be lashed to the mast. I guess I'm just trying to picture this, and I'm a little fuzzy on some of the details. But let's keep going, because the song is great, and I do think it's kind of smart to try and, if you want to have him get advice, this allows you to have that conversation of, you're leading up to, I'm assuming we're going to skip this whole issue with the crashing rocks. It's kind of a throwaway encounter, like really Scylla and Charybdis are far more scary. To explain, you've got to get to Scylla and Charybdis, and like, how do you get through that? And also it's like, what am I even going to face? You're kind of in uncharted water here, especially for them. They don't really know where they are. Smart to move this to the Siren encounter, because we're not going back to Circe. So you allow in some moments of sort of exposition, but it's also the Siren has an angle, so I'm trying to get you to come in the water. Anywho, I'm babbling. Let's get back to the song.
How am I to evade him? How am I to get home?
Yeah.
Which route should I take?
Very specific pockets of the water.
He will chase you high and low, so find a place he'd never go. The one way you'll get home is sailing where he's scared to roam. Oh, it's through the lair of Scylla
And Charybdis.
This is your only way home.
Okay. Question. Nobody really answered, because I assume the musical is going to tell me, but this is the question I'll pose. Why are we only talking about Scylla? Because Scylla and Charybdis as a strait is extremely important in the mythology, and it's important to the Greeks because there's actually a really well-known saying that comes out of it, which is between Scylla and Charybdis, aka their version, the ancient Greek and modern Greek equivalent of saying between a rock and a hard place, because it's kind of your Kobayashi Maru. It's your no-win scenario. You're going to lose people. It's just pick, how much do you want to gamble with your life? Guarantee you'll only lose 6, or risk losing everyone, including yourself? Because almost nobody has ever really survived aiming on the side of Charybdis. It's just a really bad idea. So you gotta pick. Interesting, we're saying through the lair of Scylla, and that it's a place that Poseidon is scared to go. It's never really said explicitly he's scared to go there. I think it's more that, frankly, he doesn't have to. Like, why bother? It's like, look, Scylla and Charybdis, they chill in their spots. They don't ever move. They're doing all the work for him. It's sort of like, I don't need to touch this. I don't need to bother with this area, because, like, if people want to know how to get through it, they can figure it out, and I don't really have to do anything. So, of course, Poseidon's not going to show up there. He'd look at it and go, what a waste of effort. Scylla and Charybdis will take care of them. So I don't really think it's so much fear, but, like, whatever. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm just saying that, like, oh, you know, in the mythology, that's it. I am confused, slightly looking sideways at why we're calling it the lair of Scylla, and not, like, I get really hard to rhyme Strait of Scylla and Charybdis. Like, that does not roll off the tongue, But I do also think it's a misrepresentation when you say it's a lair of Scylla. So you never really go into Scylla's lair. Her lair is actually pretty up high in the cliffs. So she's not down really on sea level ever. Interesting. Musically, I like how we have the change. We go down into piano, very dark, discordant, kind of minor sounding and creepy notes. And I'm like, ooh, we're emphasizing Scylla is fucking scary. Which, yes, she is. I'm going to back up a little bit so I can hear the start of that portion just again.
Lair of Scylla.
Oh, there it is.
This is your
Oh, so he's heard of it, which I guess they would have.
the lair of Scylla.
But Scylla has a cost.
Well, you asked to know.
That sounds like Puppeteer. That's what it was. It was killing me. I'm like, where do I know this? That sounds a bit like Puppeteer. Dun, 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 dun. This has to have been on purpose, and I'd bet it's because Jorge knows the Roman myth, which tells of how Scylla and Circe have an encounter, which I talked about in the Circe Saga, which relates around a sort of water god type character named Glaukos. It does have Roman sources. Now, whether it had Greek sources prior to that, I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't think we have any written evidence for it. That's sort of why I only mentioned it in passing and didn't talk about it too much, is because our primary source on that is Roman. Regardless, nice, neat little construction there. I see you, Jorge. I hear you, Jorge.
You know, now jump in the water.
Penelope, why? You know I'm too shy.
Well, we switched tone back real fast.
I would take the suffering from you.
Ooh, for you I would die, but can't you let me stay
I
dry?
can take the suffering from you.
We're spending an awful long time getting through the Sirens here.
I will take the
A little too long, really. It shouldn't take this long. The idea is you want to go through the Sirens as fast as
Things I
possible.
do for you.
Whoa! Okay, hold on. Let's pause here. So we heard an arrow shot and a kind of unearthly scream, which I'm assuming means they shot a siren basically out of the sky. I was noting at the end of this song that it seems really almost odd how much time we're taking here, because the idea of the sirens is get through them as quickly as possible. Like, really, row for your life, don't stop, don't waste time there, because the likelihood of you getting in trouble is based around how much time you're spending there. With a lot of these things, the same thing would go with Scylla and Charybdis, though that one a little leeway because it's some tough sailing you have to do to get through there. Very interesting. We are taking so much time in this encounter. It seems like we're basically making it into parts, which Homer and every other ancient writer is like, bro, why are you still here? Get out! You know, Orpheus is like, bitch, I did not sing at the top of my lungs while they rode for their lives for you to just be lollygagging around these people. I'm curious why we're spending so much time here. I wonder if this is supposed to relate to the idea of Odysseus saying, now I'll become the monster, which we'll see if he actually does, because I'd argue this change he talks about making at the end of Act 1 is sort of, I'd said it felt almost performative, because I don't think he's changed at all in any respect in the core of who his character is throughout Act 1, and so we'll see what happens here. Now, fighting the Sirens, it's sort of, again, not to keep talking before I even keep going with the song, it is just sort of odd, because there's no reason for it. Like, there's no reason for you to keep hanging around the Sirens, because, like, again, he should be lashed to the mast, because if he's having this conversation, it implies that his ears do not have the beeswax in it, again, as it is in the Odyssey, and the moment they start singing, like, really start singing, he should therefore be under their spell. So a lot of this bit of the encounter, it sounds like I'm nitpicking and I'm criticizing. This is more absolute confusion, because there's reasons the Sirens operate the way that they do and why people go through the encounter the way that they do in the Odyssey. And in addition, when I reference the Argonautica, which is the story of Jason and the Argonauts and how they got through it that way, again, they had kind of a cheat code in the form of Orpheus, who could sing louder and more beautifully than the Sirens. Bonus points of being the son of a muse. I mean, in his story, mostly linked with Eurydice, a lot of people are familiar with the fact that he has that voice. So I have some questions, Jorge, as to why we're playing the encounter this way, because yes, it flies in the face of all the mythology, but it also kind of leaves questions about how exactly are these creatures operating that Odysseus can just so readily, apparently, now just wound one of them, continue on through this when he should be lashed to a mast, because that was really the only way he was going to survive that encounter if he was so curious that he had to listen, which of course Odysseus was so curious that he had to listen, like of course he was. And this is not a case where, again, while this part of the encounter in the Odyssey, we are hearing straight from the mouth of Odysseus. While he plays it up that, hey, yeah, I got to listen to the Siren song, he explains that it was extremely difficult and painful. He was lashed to the mast and his men had to keep tying him tighter because he kept trying to fight against it to jump in the goddamn water. And it tells you again how powerful the song of the Sirens is. Despite the fact, like, the idea of, like, okay, part bird, part woman, and she sings real pretty, like, really, how scary is it? It's fucking scary. There's a reason it was so scary to the Greeks. Anyhow, let's keep going on into different beast and see what kind of shenanigans we have to continue in the Siren encounter.
Let's cut the charade. You are no wife of mine.
Which he'd know, but the audience might not.
You've been trying to take my life this whole time.
That's kind of what they do.
I know underwater there are packs of you hiding.
Underwater?
Yeah, I know exactly what you are. A siren.
Oh, okay. Let's take a minute and talk about this, because this is actually... I'm going to be super nerdy for a second, because this is actually interesting. I'm sure a lot of people were probably then confused why I was saying, hey, the Sirens are birds. They are bird-like. We're going to quickly skedaddle, and I will show you the very famous ancient image of Odysseus and the Sirens.
We are back to the magic chart. So this is an extremely famous image from, I believe, an Attican figure, and it says, a siren kills herself because the lure of her song has failed. Odysseus is lashed to the mast. The men, their ears stopped with beeswax, row past the Sirens to safety. So this shows you, this is how the Sirens were imagined. Part bird, part woman. And so they'd fly around to lead you to your doom. Ha ha ha.
So, the Sirens are described in all of the ancient texts as being bird-like. Part bird, part woman. They are an interesting contrast to another part bird, part woman creature in mythology who are known as the Harpies, except they are, like, ugly and terrifying and gluttonous and ravenous and terrible, so, like, interesting contrast between the two of them. However, more modern belief seems to conflate them with the tales of, say, mermaids. Now, while there are some ancient images that involve there also being tails on the Sirens, they are still winged creatures. It's like they got wings and then bonus points they have tails. Probably imagine something like a flying fish, I guess. But this is where I get to be nerdy, because this explains why nowadays people don't immediately think of the actual imagery, which is them as birds. Like, why do we think they are mermaids? With, like, why are wings no longer part of their imagery? And you know who we can blame? Frickin' medieval monks. I'm not even joking, we get to blame the medieval monks. So in the medieval period, obviously we know of these things such as illuminated manuscripts and illuminated texts. Well, monks would write these things that are called bestiaries, essentially like an encyclopedia of beasts, real and mythical, and for the most part, even those mythical creatures they genuinely thought were real, and they would be illuminated, aka also illustrated. And so the imagery of the works by these monks, a lot of the ones that we have coming from areas like the British Isles, started drawing the Sirens as mermaids. Probably due to similar mythology of the British Isles, you have things like selkies and the like of women, part fish, and mermaids and all the like there. And that kind of got conflated. And so over time, you then just have this imagery being passed down of the Siren being a creature that is part fish, part woman, as opposed to part bird, part woman. And you might say, like, oh, well, why don't they just have the original texts? A lot of those texts were lost. It's not like there were a lot of copies of them. And again, forever angry about the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Like, so many records just gone. But there were limited supplies of the ancient texts, and often in places where these monks would not have access to them. So a lot of it came to their imagination, and they're like, well, we know of things like selkies, we know of all of these. Obviously, that's what the Sirens are if they're beautiful women who sing and are in part of the ocean. but in fact they are avian. While it may seem weird, like why are they birds and not fish, like the idea of them being more mermaid-like probably makes a lot of sense to our brains. The avian aspect actually makes a lot of sense too. If you think about the idea of seabirds and how much especially they feature in kind of the lore and the superstitions of sailors, like it's bad luck to kill a seabird, and you can imagine if you were on the sea for long periods of time and you maybe don't see land around you, the sound of a seabird would hearken that land is probably nearby and you would be desperate to get to land. That is where you get the Greeks then pulling from the idea of like the siren song of a seabird calling you to land, but it's more like a mirage in the desert because in fact where you're going towards are razor sharp rocks that will kill you, and then even if you make it to these rocks, it's not actually land, it's just a rock kind of out in the ocean and you will waste away and die. So, to the Greeks, the idea of these being avian makes so much sense, and even obviously to this day it makes sense, but
Medieval monks and your bestiaries
made it so people don't often realize that, unless of course they have seen, again, that very famous image from, I believe it is an Attican vase, or the like, which shows the Sirens as they are in the Odyssey, and that is actually the encounter from the Odyssey. It's Odysseus lashed to the mast. So, fun fact, that's why I could realize very quickly, like, I'm not going to sit here and harp on it and say, like, how dare you change it? It's like, it makes a lot of sense that a change happens because most people, like, unless you know, you don't really realize. Though granted, if you've read the Odyssey, I'm pretty sure they talk about them having wings and the like. But regardless, similarly to how you have Jorge thinking Iolia is a floating island in the sky versus an island that's floating on the water, thinking the Sirens have, tails and are more like mermaids probably was something he immediately thought of and made a lot of sense to him in his head versus, oh, they were part birds, and then you start thinking and thinking and thinking. So, whereas I would much more love to see the seabird siren and the proper representation of them, I'm so used to people doing them as more mermaid type creatures that I sort of have to sort of sigh and shrug because I'm like, of course. And also, we know where people have now, that has become popularized and why. Fun facts. Sorry for the long tangent. Fun fact. Ooh, this
My real wife knows I'm not scared of the water. And my real wife knows I don't have a daughter.
All these things we clocked.
But while you were so focused on turning my men into snacks, you didn't notice that your friends got snatched.
What? Huh?
We are a different beast now. We are the ones who feast now. No more of us deceased, cause we won't take more suffering from you. We are the man-made monsters. We are the ones who conquer. You are a threat no longer. We won't take more suffering from you.
Interesting. So this is meant to be the song, we're coming into Act 2 that's meant to show this is the change in Odysseus. He's become more monstrous. Kinda isn't, though. Like, we are, the ones who feast now and all this. It's like, well, you guys have kind of been terrible the whole way. The whole thing with Polyphemus, you rolled up to Circe, and like all this, you came off of the sack of Troy. There's nothing really different in his character at all. Even in these men, like they're talking the talk, but they're not really walking the walk. And I will also note that in killing the Sirens, they wouldn't necessarily be doing anything wrong. No god would really look at them and say, how dare you? Like, the Sirens are absolutely treated in mythology as monsters. They are extremely dangerous. Also, the fact that we are spending so much time here with, frankly, no consequences is a little confusing to me, just because I know how dangerous the Sirens are meant to be. And this just feels like, you just want to clear on out of here as fast as possible. You wouldn't be wasting the time to chat with the Sirens and kind of gloat over the fact that you beat them. You'd just be like really glad that you got out of there and nobody jumped off and you lived. So again, while I see what I think Jorge is trying to do here with this whole like gloating session we're essentially having over the Sirens is to show that like they're different, they are angrier, they're tougher, they're going to be more ruthless, if you will, I argue that they're already ruthless. Like, this is, again, it's posturing. It's very much, I would say, Odysseus's change is very performative. And part of it, I think, is also a cognitive dissonance, is that while I think Odysseus thinks maybe, and his men, I guess, maybe think that this is what's happening, it isn't actually. My one real question, and this is like really only a question I'd be able to ask Jorge and have him answer, is does he realize that his characters really aren't any different? That ultimately these characters have not changed. If you really would want to take Odysseus down a proper, like, descending spiral, you'd kind of have to bend his character over backwards to try and make that happen. These are questions I'm interrogating the narrative over because that speaks to the writing. And if the writing is leaving anybody with this many questions of like, I think this is what you mean, and this is what you mean, but is this really what you mean? It speaks to maybe how the writing could be a little more clear. While I think I understand what Jorge is trying to do, and a lot of people have, put forth in the comments, they say like, this is the arc we're going on, and etc. The musical is a little muddled on it. It kind of flip-flops and doesn't always seem as like crystal clear as it could be. So interesting. I would also just say, again, while I understand what this song is doing, having a gloating session over the Sirens it's a little silly to me just as somebody who knows the mythology. Because like, you would not waste time hanging out with the Sirens. Like, it's just a recipe for getting yourself in more trouble. AKA, you're giving the Sirens a chance to lure your men to certain death. So it's like, why are we spending time here? Again, I understand why in the context of Epic we're doing it, but on the overall, I'd just be like, oh, hell no, just get out. Get out. Don't spend time here. Run. And by run, I mean sail. Flee. Towards Scylla and Charybdis, which is gonna suck as much, but
Been away from home for about 12 years or so.
Yeah, pretty close. That's about right.
Slayed in our own war, and now we're here with more foes.
Yeah.
On the run from Poseidon.
I will note where he says, we slayed in our own war, and now we meet more foes, we encounter more foes. This is very common. This is a Greek concept known as nostos, which is essentially a return journey home by sea. And it's usually like you went on your grand adventure, you came home, and you had a nostos, in which you usually had more adventures, you probably encountered more foes, and I mean, understandable. Again, nascent naval technology. Sailing with good direction seems to have not been the Greeks' strong suit, if Odysseus' journey is anything to go by, because basically he's overshooting Greece by so many directions. That's part of why he just can't seem to get home on the first go. So the idea that you would be encountering other opponents, other monsters, other places, like, very common. And Greeks would use a nostos to achieve more glory and more fame, especially if you survive through it and you come home with big tales to tell. Obviously, you can't take time in a musical to, like, sit there and explain what a nostos is, although it is super core to the Odyssey, like that literally Odysseus's whole journey, the actual Odyssey is his nostos. It is his return home. So this is kind of an interesting way where it seems like, I would hope Jorge is sort of trying to lean in like, hey, this is what the nostos is you're journeying home and you're just meeting more opponents because you're ending up in almost uncharted waters in different places because we can't navigate all that great. It's a fun fact. I wonder if that's sort of what we're trying to reference here.
We found a ship with no crew. I realized
so the sailors had jumped.
Singing sailors to the
yeah, you'd hear it and it'd give it away.
We filled our ears with beeswax.
Yep.
That's how we resist your song. You pretended to be my wife, so I just played along.
Okay, so is the musical implying then that Odysseus also had wax in his ears, and that is why he didn't just go jumping into the sea? And I'm assuming we didn't, lash him to the mast, which we, very dramatically do in the Odyssey. In which case, is he lip reading the sirens the whole time? I guess, if we're making them more mermaid-like, we would see the siren in the water as opposed to, flying above. Is he lip reading the whole time? He would have to be frowning at her like, what the fuck? That's also a massive gamble to take, that she would know the answer to where they need to go, because he has no guarantee that a siren would know where to go. There's no real record of the sirens necessarily knowing where they need to go. So that's a big gamble we're having him take. It's not necessarily ruthless, it's reckless as hell, which, I mean, Odysseus is on the side of reckless. And to be fair, the siren encounter in the Odyssey is sort of Odysseus' recklessness on display, although he takes massive countermeasures against it, because obviously he's being reckless and hyper-curious, and that he wants to be someone who said, I heard the song of the sirens. But again, he has to be lashed to the mast to make that happen. So in this case, he's not hearing the Song of the Sirens. He's apparently lip reading, which, dude, your eyesight must be phenomenal. I could never. My eyes are so messed up, I could never. I'd be like, what? Did you hear what can anybody read lips? Do you have somebody with, GSL, Greek Sign Language, hanging out on the shit?
I'm sorry, I should stop making jokes.
I read your lips and phrases.
Oh, he answered my question.
Sirens know about every route and horizon.
Oh.
Now I know how to get back to my island.
Well, thank you, Song, for answering me on that one. See why he took the risk. This part of the plan, though, is an unnecessary risk. Just move along. Who is the bass? I can feel that bass, like, deep in my diaphragm. There is a bass on the bottom of the crew, and it's like I can feel the rumble almost more than I can actually hear the note they're singing. I'm assuming a lot of these dudes who are singing the crew, obviously we've got Eurylochus in there, but other dudes, I'm wondering if it was, some of the guys who maybe sing some of the gods maybe came in and sang for some of the crew. I mean, it'd be a good use of talent, especially if you are trying to keep your budget down, basically.
Who's the bass?
There's a bass in there, and I hear you. Who knows who that bass is? Sorry, I'm a sucker for a really good bass. You might as...
Why? So you can kill the next group of sailors in this part of the sea? Nah, you wouldn't have spared me.
Well, if they got through, actually they would have.
Like this, it almost cost my life. I can't take more risks of not seeing my wife.
Well, now, like I said, the whole "you wouldn't have spared me." Well, if they'd managed to sail through the Sirens don't chase you. They just kind of wait for the next boat to come along, right? They're not going to chase after you. So technically, yeah, they actually would have. Now, again, as I noted, they are monsters, kind of in the Greek mythos. So the idea of them killing them is like, okay, sure, just most people wouldn't bother or dare because it's just not worth the try. Similarly to Scylla and Charybdis, like you're not going to beat them, just continue on and try not to die. Which again shows you the danger of the world around you. Which, while I understand Epic is trying to make a big difference here with him saying, like, I made a mistake like this once, and he's talking, I would assume, about the Polyphemus encounter where I didn't, kill an enemy that I should have. I just don't think the Sirens are the best way to do that. Granted, I don't know what you would do instead, so I guess really he kind of has no other option for that. If you're trying to have Odysseus have this moment of saying, well, I'm different now, which again, I would argue, Odysseus really doesn't seem that different. Dude, you're kind of the same. You're being brutalist, essentially, which he is. Understandably so, considering the danger of the world that he's in. And again, also especially since he's on Anostos, which are traditionally quite dangerous. Bonus points, he's now got a god on his ass, and now he's sailing through waters where that god doesn't even want to go, because the god's like, why bother? Like, you'll die there. Why am I gonna go to the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis? You're gonna die there. Oh, they're going to the Sirens? Not even gonna bother. Maybe part of it is that he's trying to convince the crew that he's different. That could work, because the crew would be in kind of a rough spot. I mean, they have also been witnessing a lot of what has happened. Maybe not the entirety of the Polyphemus incident, of course, but everything that happened with ruthlessness, yeah, they watched that happen. They saw the power of a god, and they're like, oh, shit, and now we're having to go through the Sirens. If you're trying to make sure, considering we know a mutiny is ultimately coming, if he's trying to show, hey, I'm different now and things will be better, but then things won't be because, again, the story of Odysseus, you're just in for more suffering, always and almost forever, then I at least hope, this is where, again, these are questions really only Jorge would be able to answer for me, is like, do you understand that your character isn't necessarily changing, and does the musical itself understand that, and is that on purpose? Again, I'm interrogating the narrative because these are questions that I have as I'm listening, because that's going to ultimately help me when I reach the end of the musical coalesce my thoughts.
Cut off their tails! We're ending this now!
Yeah, so they're mermaid-like.
Throw their bodies back in the water.
Woo! Rough. But catching all of them? Granted, we never really know how many Sirens there are, so... Oh, the bass. He is. So this is almost like a performance for the crew. It's still really risky to take the time to do this. It's really a risk. It's paying off for him here, but... So that is how we bring back in Act 2. So a really fascinating way to bring back in the musical after our kind of understood intermission. Coming in with the Sirens, you bury the lead on that in order for the audience who's not aware of the trip with the Sirens to be like, what is going on? Now, the song itself leaves hints, I mean, big stuff being like, there's no way Odysseus would be afraid of swimming or generally of the water in terms of just like the water in its existence, mainly because he's from Ithaca, he grew up on an island, but the sea is dangerous. So there's that. And little hints to lead you in that something is a little off. The little musical notes talking about Scylla, which are similar, I do believe, to Puppeteer. It's somewhere in the Circe Saga, but it took me a second to realize I'm pretty sure that's Puppeteer. Clever little bit of nod to mythology for those who know. If you don't know, doesn't even matter. It sounds kind of creepy and eerie, and so leads into the like, oh shit, this is dangerous. As much as I was like, wait, how is he hearing all this stuff with the beeswax? The song immediately answered me on that. I do think this whole stop feels like a big performance for the crew, coming out of the underworld and trying to say things are going to be different now. We're definitely getting home, which is going to be tough when they then roll through the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis and have to lose 6 people. Now, if they were hold to the encounter, they end up losing 6 people and then accidentally almost get ripped into Charybdis and manage to get their way out. It's a real testament to the seamanship of Odysseus and his men. Like, clearly they are incredible sailors to like, they get in a really tight spot and manage to get their way out. But I do find it interesting we're talking about Scylla and we're not talking about Charybdis anyway. I mean, one, I can imagine it's hard to rhyme, which I totally get, but maybe calling it the Strait of Scylla as opposed to the lair of Scylla, because again, it is described that Scylla's lair is up pretty high in these cliffs. It's not down on the water level, if that makes sense. We'll talk more about Scylla when we get to her, which I do believe she's the next song, so we'll talk more about the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis there. But overall, a nice way to kind of jump back in. I do think it's interesting that Odysseus says all this stuff about how, oh, I'm going to be more monstrous now and I'm doing all this stuff. I'm like, bro, your actions are no different. You're as brutal as you were in the first act. You're lying to yourself. But the element of the way the crew has almost a call and response to the things that he says makes me think that he's putting on a performance for the crew. He's trying to let them know that he's different. But granted, that would seem weird when we come out of Monster and he seems to very much be trying to convince the audience that he's making a change. So is that a way of saying, in a metaverse way, that like the audience is being brought into this and he's trying to convince us that he's going to change? Because really, I don't think he has. And this is the tough part of trying to do an arc like this with Odysseus when he's a character who changes, but often like really small and subtle ways. He doesn't go through a big, massive character change. And as a character, it doesn't, in mythology at least, doesn't necessarily make sense to be one to go through a massive character change in the way that the musical is setting him up. Like, I think Jorge absolutely made his job more difficult for him. I commend him for wanting to take a difficult route, but he did make his job harder because the way Odysseus as a character functions is that, like, you kind of have to bend him over backwards and reach to try and have him really go through some kind of serious character change. And taking him on this sort of de-evolution of starting in one place and ending in another, it doesn't necessarily suit his character in terms of how it also suits the story. Because at the end of the day, a lot of his actions, even here in the musical seems to be constantly trying to justify them. Which is interesting. I mean, like, we're left again with a lot of cognitive dissonance here. And part of that is me wondering, like, does the musical understand it has this cognitive dissonance, or is it an area where maybe the writing needs some, like, tightening and tweaking in places so that that dissonance is lessened and it just makes it way more clear where the musical stands in terms of, like, how much are we meant to believe Odysseus and what he says is a change in him? When I'm sitting on the outside looking, going like, bro, you haven't really changed all that much.
Same shit, different monster.
And again, killing the Sirens, like, the Greeks at least wouldn't see that as a big deal. They'd be shocked you took the time to do it, because it's just like, again, for the Greeks, they are avian, they'd be harder to catch. It's just not worth the effort. Like, just move on through. But the musical is having this song serve a purpose. So as much as I sort of look at it going like, bro, just move along, I get what the musical's doing. But next up, we've got the Strait of Scylla and Charybdis, which is R.I.P. to 6 people. We'll just put that out there now. R.I.P. to the 6 dudes who about to die.